Hey, what's up? It's Jared with State of Tech. Today we're going to take a look at the iPhone 11 Pro Max and whether or not it lives up to that Pro name as far as the cameras go. Now, when Apple announced this phone, they talked a lot about the cameras and the Pro features that these cameras had. And really, it kind of blew me away. I loved the way that they integrated the multiple cameras with the software and the ease of use and the flexibility that is all there with being able to shoot and see the images from different lenses at the same time. There was just some really neat processing and kind of some the magical experience that we have come to know and expect from an iPhone was definitely there. But does it live up to the Pro name when it comes to capturing images? Is it that much better than last year's iPhone or maybe even the iPhone prior? And then also, can it even withstand being considered professional like a Sony a7 III or some sort of camera like that somebody could use professionally? That was what I really wanted to understand, and so I took my iPhone 11 Pro Max and my Sony a7 III with a couple of lenses out and just went riding around on my boosted rev scooter, looking around, trying to find something interesting to take photos of in some different situations. I took some portraits of myself, both with the cameras. I wanted to see if I could actually shoot self-portraits, both with the iPhone and with my Sony a7 III, and then also with the different lenses and see kind of the different distortions that it would have in a portrait situation. Because with those three lenses, we really want to understand what the best use cases are for all three of them, how they affect the overall image, and whether or not you can even consider it a professional solution. So I'm going to talk a bit about that here on the State of Tech channel, but if you are really interested in seeing the nitty-gritty details on the images and the video clips, including autofocus and stuff like that, you're definitely going to want to check out the other video that I'm launching over on Ditch Auto, which is my photography channel. On this channel, we definitely talk a lot about technology and specs and details and how I feel about different products, and we're going to do that in this video. And if you're really interested in kind of pixel peeping and seeing the details of each image, we're going to do that over on the other channel. So let's talk more about the features here and the comparisons and how I did this comparison. So on the iPhone 11 Pro, we've got the three cameras on the back, one on the front. All three of these cameras, even the one on the front, so four I guess, shoot 4K 60p video. They're 12 megapixel cameras, so that's pretty good for a smartphone camera. Most other phones do not have that. So on the back of the phone here, we've got three different cameras with three different focal lengths. One is an ultra-wide at 13 millimeter focal length equivalent. Now what that means by equivalent is that the standard for focal lengths is based off of 35 millimeters, which a typical full frame camera like the Sony a7 III is a 35 millimeter equivalent camera. So if you bought a 35 millimeter lens for your full frame camera, you're getting 35 millimeters. On a camera like this, for example, which is the Sony a6400 with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, this camera has a crop sensor. It is a smaller sensor than full frame, so there is a crop effect that happens. So this lens actually appears to be closer to the subject than it would normally be. So 24 to 70 ends up being 1.4 times that in the instance of this lens. And the same goes on an iPhone like this. These lenses are actually super wide, but the equivalent is what we're going to be talking about because that's what compares it to all the other different cameras. So 13 millimeter, we also have a 26 millimeter and a 52 millimeter, and each of those have a different aperture range. Now on an iPhone, you can't adjust the aperture. It is a fixed aperture, which means that there's no way to limit the amount of light that is hitting the sensor of the camera, with the only exception being the shutter speed as an adjustment. So you can adjust the shutter speed, and you can also adjust the ISO, and those are pro settings. If you're not in a camera app that has pro settings, you're essentially letting the camera itself do that. And in my test today, I wanted to use the default camera app because that's the app that is best optimized right now for all three of these cameras. So I took my Sony a7 III and I have a 16 to 35 millimeter lens and then also that 24 to 70 millimeter. I don't have anything that goes as wide as a 13 millimeter, so I took the 13 millimeter of the iPhone, and that one's being compared with the 16 millimeter on the Sony full frame. Now, then I also went and zoomed zoomed in to 26 millimeters on that lens, and then compared that. And then I put on the 24-70 and zoomed in to 52 millimeters for the telephoto. Now, 52 millimeters is not really telephoto focal length for a camera. Usually you have to get close to around 100 millimeters or more for it to be considered telephoto, or maybe even an 85 millimeter can be considered telephoto. 52 millimeter is usually kind of a medium range lens, but that is what the iPhone has. So in comparing these cameras, I took photos with both cameras at all focal lengths, and so that I can compare those images and see the distortion around the edges, the compression on the images, and then also just the overall sharpness and detail of the images from the very center point of the image to the edge of the image. Because those are the things that are going to determine whether or not an image would be considered something that was shot on a pro piece of equipment. A camera like an iPhone obviously is super limited because the phone is super thin. It has to have 3 cameras in order to achieve this because you can't zoom in on these types of fixed focal length cameras like you can on a camera that has a zoom lens. For example, this lens, I can zoom in and out by rotating the barrel. I can't do that on an iPhone. So I've been showing you some of those images just so that you can kind of see the difference. It is really hard to see the difference on a YouTube video. So I've posted these photos over on the Ditch Auto website. Normally I post photos and stuff like that on the State of Tech website. But since I'm doing the more detailed comparison with the images on Ditch Auto for those that are super interested in the more detail, those are where the images are at, and I'll link to that down in the description below. So the lines are definitely blurring much more these days as to what you can do with a smartphone versus what you need to buy a more expensive camera for. Obviously, the iPhone maxes out at 52 millimeters unless you zoom past that, and at which stage you are digitally zooming and your image quality starts to go down. So 52 millimeters still does not get you really that close to the action. If you need to get closer, you're going to either need to buy some sort of a lens attachment for your iPhone, or you're going to have to go to more of a professional solution. So as long as you are okay with staying relatively close to your subject or what you're wanting to take photos of, the iPhone works out really well. And of course, even with a Sony camera or a more professional camera, you're talking about buying more lenses to have more functionality there as well. The lens right here, the 16 to 35, this is a relatively wide angle lens. 16 millimeter to 35 millimeter does not get you very close to your action, whereas a 24 to 70 millimeter lens would get you a lot closer. And then of course I also have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens that gets me really close to the action when I need to. On the iPhone, you're not going to have that. You're going to get 52 millimeters, and then anything beyond that is going to be downhill from there. So the iPhone's quality of image was very surprising to me. Of course, the portrait mode is something that's also really interesting on the camera, and the portrait mode has gotten better. There's a 1x and a 2x mode in portrait mode now, where you can actually shoot a slightly wider portrait or something a little bit closer, and it's not much of a difference, the 1x to 2x, but you definitely can see a difference as I've showed you in these two images. Now, a portrait mode essentially is faking the depth of field that you would get out of a standard photography lens. So these lenses being an f2.8 on the photography lenses, an f2.8 gets you a decent shallow depth of field. If you'll notice in what you're looking at now, I'm in focus and the books behind me are super out of focus. That's because I'm shooting at a real shallow depth of field right now. If I was shooting this same shot with the iPhone, I would not have that type of depth of field because of the way that the lenses are inside of the cameras. Even though the maximum aperture on these cameras is wider than the f2.8 lenses and faster than the f2.8 lenses, which means more light can get in, it doesn't have the same depth of field effect because of the length of the lens and all of the different elements inside of the lens. It's not the same. So a professional camera is going to be able to get that portrait mode right out of camera without having to do any processing. And of course, even though the iPhone has gotten much better at portrait mode, you still sometimes get some fuzzy, kind of blurry edges around your subject depending on the lighting situation, but the iPhone does do a really good job at that portrait mode, and being able to actually adjust it is something that you can't really do too well on a traditional camera without making some camera settings changes and really understanding your camera well. I'm going to talk more about that in the video on Ditch Auto. So I'll real briefly touch on autofocus. That's something that I'm going to save for the Ditch Auto video. I was pleasantly surprised in the autofocus on the iPhone. Obviously, Sony has been making some huge advancements in autofocus with eye autofocus, the camera being able to determine which eye is closest to the camera and actually pull focus on that specific portion of a person's face. The iPhone doesn't necessarily have eye autofocus, but it does a great job at tracking the subject as it moves in and out of the scene and around the scene, so it keeps that subject in focus really well. Leaps and bounds over where the iPhone was even just a few years ago. So obviously the best camera is going to be the one that you have with you. A iPhone is definitely something you could just throw in your pocket, whereas a Sony a7 III or a6400 with a nice lens on it is not pocketable and is just not as practical as an iPhone. But in professional situations, you're more apt to carry a camera bag on you with some cameras and lenses and all of that stuff. So can you compare the iPhone 11 Pro to a professional camera? Well, I think that if you compare the iPhone 11 to other phones, you can consider the iPhone 11 Pro a pro camera. I have the Note 10 and the S10 and the Pixel 3, and of all of those phones, the better overall experience with the camera goes to the iPhone because of the way that the app works with being able to see multiple focal lengths at a time, which you can't do on other phones, and you also can't do on a professional camera. And that's another point I'll mention real quick. When I'm at 24 millimeters on this camera, looking through the eyepiece here, all I'm seeing is 24 millimeters. When I zoom into 70 millimeters, all I'm seeing is 70 millimeters. The camera is not giving me the ability to see outside of that. And when I capture an image on that camera, I'm getting that focal length and that focal length only. Whereas on the iPhone, if I shoot with the medium focal length or the telephoto, I'm getting additional crop factor there, which means I can actually zoom out and recrop that image, and the phone saves that data for me for up to 30 days so that I can always go back in and recrop that image should I want to reposition the subject, should I want to get something else from the background in the image. That's something that the iPhone does that these other cameras just can't do, and it's a unique feature of having multiple camera sensors on your phone. Another unique thing to the iPhone 11 Pro is the ability when shooting video to flawlessly zoom between the different cameras and get a really nice smooth camera zoom. And there's some real interesting probably computations going on in the background because with these different focal lengths, there's different compressions, the cameras have different f-stops, and so there's settings that need to be synced up for you to just zoom between the cameras flawlessly and not have that stepping effect that you get with most other phones. Even last year's iPhone, when you are zooming between the two different cameras, it kind of steps into that other camera, or if you tap the button to get it to switch to the other camera, it definitely has that jumping effect. With a professional camera, of course, while I'm shooting video, I can do like a smooth zoom here, but the problem is that the rotation of the barrel is pretty large, and especially on more cinematography lenses, the rotation is even greater. And so it makes sense to have some sort of a motor to do it for you so that you can control that more smoothly. Doing it on a camera like this means a lot of camera shake is going to happen because I'm literally rotating a large portion of the camera in order to zoom in. And so the zoom is not always super smooth unless you have a lens that is motorized. And there are motorized lenses if you go into more professional range cameras. A lot of of the lenses have a motorized zoom, which makes it much more smooth. The iPhone has what appears to be a motorized zoom, even though it's happening all digitally and using math and everything to get you that really cool effect. They did a really good job on that, and I think it's a great addition to the iPhone. Other things that you're getting that really do make the iPhone 11 feel more like a pro solution is real-time actual rendering of the bokeh look and effect that you're getting out of the camera. That's something that you get out of mirrorless cameras, because the mirrorless cameras are taking the analog information and creating and converting it to a digital, and I can see it on the back of the screen and I can see it in the EVF here on the camera. And so when I want to see that really cool blurred out background behind my subject, or maybe it's later at night and the out of focus car lights in the background have that really cool globe looking effect, the iPhone is actually doing that and rendering all of that in real time using software, because it doesn't have the lenses to pull it off. So you're getting that really cool look and you're actually able to see it live. Just like on a camera like this, I can see it live because of the way that this camera works with bringing all the light and everything in, hitting the sensor, and of course converting it to a digital image so that I can see it in real time on the back of the screen. That is something that takes a lot of processing power, and it's something that the iPhone does on the fly, as well as give you a live preview of HDR. So if you are shooting in an HDR mode, the iPhone is giving you a preview of that, whereas even these cameras like my Sony cameras cannot give you a preview of an HDR image. You have to take the photo and then of course let the processing happen, and then you see HDR. A lot of cameras don't even do HDR internally. You actually have to do that in some sort of an app, and most of the time I do that inside of an app because the cameras don't do that great of a job of processing an HDR image like the iPhone does these days. So this all begs the question, can an iPhone replace a professional camera or a camera that a pro could use? I would say no, you really can't yet, because there just isn't the focal length range, and these lenses are so compressed and compact that they can't produce the quality of image that you would expect out of a professional lens. You could definitely take some amazing images with your iPhone, and the iPhone has grown in leaps and bounds over the years in its ability to capture great images, but there's just something that you can't really do in a thin razor blade piece of equipment like this that you can do inside of a big lens like this. There's a reason that the camera bodies are small and the lenses are large. It requires that amount of space with all the different pieces of glass and everything that is happening inside of that lens to get the image that we want out of a professional style camera. You're not going to be able to get that without a bunch of software trying to do it for you on an iPhone. Software is getting really smart, and we see that in portrait mode, and on some other phones having a live portrait type of mode in video, but it's just not quite the same as you would expect to get on a camera such as this. So I've got links down in the description below to all the gear that I used in this video and the comparisons and stuff, so that you can take a look. If you're trying to make the decision on whether or not to just upgrade your iPhone to a higher end iPhone or go with a camera like the ones that I've been talking about, you're definitely going to want to check out the Ditch Auto video. That's going to answer more of those questions, as well as get deeper into the actual images than we did on this video. So I highly encourage you to click on the link down in the description below to check out that video. I'd love to see you over there at Ditch Auto. Take care.